Today we're going to be presenting on our data coaching program that we've established here at Riverside City College. My name is Brandon Owashi. I'm the Director of Institutional Research at the college, and I'll be presenting with Oliver if you want to do your introduction.
Yeah, Oliver Thompson, Professor of Justice Studies at Criminal Justice at Riverside City College. Been there forever, and so welcome.
And feel free to post any questions that you have in the chat. We'll have hopefully, if time permits, we'll have a pretty good question and answering session. So you can just remind us whatever your questions are there. We'll try to get through them then. So we will start off. So we have our, we have our tech support here that's going to help us with our poll. But we wanted to get a little bit of a pulse to see how familiar you are, your colleges, with data coaching and how far along that timeline you might be. So we have the 4 options. So you have completed at least 1 cohort. So basically your data coaching program has been established. You're in the process of implementing your first cohort, brainstorming and planning, and then maybe it's just a possibility in the future. So for our tech support, could we get the poll going? Perfect. And we'll just give a few moments for this here so that everyone can answer. And I think that might be good. So maybe we could end the poll so we could see the results. All right, so it looks like, hopefully everyone can see this, but the majority of our participants here are either in the planning and the brainstorming phase, or maybe it's just a possibility for the future. And that's kind of a little bit of what I expected coming into this. I know that data coaching has become very popular amongst California community colleges, but it's relatively a recent push for that. For us at RCC, we are actually in the process of implementing our first cohort. So we're slightly ahead of the majority of our participants here, but not very much. So we're, for the most part, in the same boat. All right, so. There we go. Moving on to our outline. So we'll just go over our brief outline of what we'll be covering today. We'll start off by going over an overview of RCC with an equity perspective. Oliver will take us through that. We'll then move into our influences. So we are far from the first California community college to implement a data coaching program. So we want to give some kudos to some of the institutions that helped us along our way, while also providing you with some of the resources of who you might want to reach out to while you're going through the phase of implementing a data coaching program. We'll jump into what data coaching is and why data coaching. So what's the importance of it and what exactly does data coaching do? Then data coaching from a faculty perspective. So once again, Oliver's going to jump in here and provide some insight on that. Then we'll go into the program logistics, some tips and tricks on how to make sure that your faculty, or sorry, not your faculty, your data coaches will be successful. And then we'll end it with some of the successes that we've seen so far in our brief go as a data coaching program at RCC. So right here, it's an overview of RCC with an equity lens. I'm going to hand this over to Oliver.
Okay, when we, good afternoon. When we begin to talk about equity and data and all of that kind of stuff, I have been at Riverside City College for over 50 years. 30 years as a part-time and last 22, going on 23 years full-time. I come out of law enforcement, Riverside Sheriff, Inglewood Police Department, where I was part-time, and then when I came on full-time in 98, 99 year points. And when we begin to look at this in 1998, 1999, that's how far we go back. We weren't talking about really calling it data or equity, all of that. It was just numbers that were crunched when we came back at the beginning of the school year in the fall. And what was intriguing to me was watching this person who was a vice president talk about numbers. And I always found that the demographics of African Americans were always at the bottom. And that went on for about 3 years. Okay, I'm short of tenure, but I'm kind of a pretty arrogant person. And I raised my hand and said, excuse me, I look at these numbers and African Americans have been at the bottom and there is no showing as to what progress to raise them off the bottom. And people began to look at me, you know, kind of sideways, like, well, what are you talking about? And I said, well, you know, if you are not African American, maybe this doesn't pop out at you, but it pops out at me. So what are we doing? So I've watched these move forward, these numbers, and then they moved into what we now call data, because that was because of the current chancellor, Dr. Isak, who came to Riverside from Moreno Valley College, and he began to, everything was data, data, data. And then from that point, we've gone into a scorecard and we've got the metrics that are outlined in front of you. And this is broken down by discipline within departments. I'm in behavioral sciences, which is sociology, psychology, anthropology, and criminal justice. And so when the numbers come out in the form that you see in front of you, I am always looking for those areas that are green, those that are yellow, and those that are red. And when I look at those numbers, I found that African Americans were still in a disadvantage. They were in a dysfunctional position. And so what can I do within my criminal justice classes to raise their awareness and education toward retention, persistence, success within the classroom setting? And so that is why I really have been heavy in looking at these numbers and what it means, and saying, okay, now what can I do within the classroom setting that I have? Thank you, Brandon.
Oh, thank you. I think that your perspective, you've been at the institution much longer than me, and the main takeaway that we have is that things haven't changed. So we have to try to do something to make them actually, these numbers move. This takes us to our next slide, which is the faculty self-reflection. So we've actually sent several teams to the Center for Urban Education, so CUE at USC. I'm sure that most of you have heard of that organization. They're pretty well known, and mainly to the Student Equity Planning Workshop. And while we're at that workshop, they have this kind of 1 hour period where you do this activity where you look at individual course success rate data for an individual faculty member. And it's this idea of reflecting back on those data to look at, you know, which student groups are doing well in your classes, which ones aren't doing well. It kind of touches back on what Dr. Thompson was talking about what he can actually do in his classroom. So this is something that we've been doing. And the process that it works is that the Office of Institutional Effectiveness helps with this process. So my role is heavily involved with this, where a faculty member who wants to see their individual course success rate or course retention rate data, disaggregated by race, ethnicity, and gender, will reach out to me and ask for these data. I gather them, provide a little bit of a write-up, and then sit down with them in a meeting to discuss some of the trends that we see and highlight some of the points that are standing out. So far, this has been really successful. Faculty members that are coming to me oftentimes say, wow, I've never seen these data ever in my entire career. So it provides kind of a baseline for these individuals to see how are students doing in their classroom. However, what we're running into now is it takes a certain type of faculty member to willingly do this, especially when the conversation is going to be with an administrator. So it's sensitive material, it's what's happening within their job. And so what we wanted to try to do is to try to change this. We feel like that there's this huge group of not unwilling, but not willing individuals at our campus. It's a lot of just indecision, you know, in the middle. And we thought that if a faculty member were to talk to another faculty member about these data, especially a faculty member that they already had a relationship with, that they might be more willing to then take a dive and take a look at these really sensitive data. So that's kind of where our data coaching program is built upon. It's this concept and this idea. So now we're going to jump into the influences that we have. As I mentioned before, we aren't the first community college to try to implement a data coaching program. So we want to recognize those that have helped us along our way. The first is Bakersfield College. I've attended several workshops that Bakersfield has put on regarding their data coaching program. And on top of that, we actually hired a researcher from Bakersfield College. He works at the district office, but has helped us and provided some insight onto what we might want to have within our data coaching program. So that's been a big help. The second is Reedley College. We were put in touch with Reedley College through the Leading from the Middle. They had attended a Leading from the Middle Institute a couple of years ago where they implemented their data coaching program. We met with them. They were extremely helpful, and they actually shared their Canvas shell with us. And something that if you're looking to do implement a data coaching program, they actually put their Canvas shell on the Canvas Commons, so anybody can search for it and anybody can find it. It's really well done, so I recommend reaching out for that if you're trying to come up with a curriculum for your data coaching program. And then the last college is Santa Monica College. This is probably one of our biggest influences. Pre-COVID, we were able to actually travel to their campus and attend some of their training sessions for their data coaches, and it was really helpful. They have a really well-established program. I think they're in their like 4th or 5th cohort now. And we actually use a lot of their resources and activities within our training program because we feel like it is really what we strive to be. So they're extremely helpful. They present a lot of times their data coaching program at different conferences. So I know that they're always willing to help out anybody who's in need of some support. And then lastly is Leading from the Middle. We sent a team to Leading from the Middle for this last year. And that team's goal was to try to bridge the gap between the data coaching program and cultural proficiency training. So we want to combine that together. So that's what we did there. While at Leading from the Middle, there's also many other teams that were working on data coaching programs. So we're able to get some insights and some help from them as well. So now we're going to jump into what exactly is data coaching. So I see it as 3 main parts. It's data literacy, data analysis, and then data communication. And the thing about these 3 parts is that while they're kind of separate things, they all build upon each other. So data literacy is really the foundation. So this is, what do you understand the data? Whether that is the metrics that you're looking at, the definitions, other terms, the methodology, and then probably most importantly, do you understand the data source that you're working with? Is it easy to understand for you, and so on and so forth. The second is data analysis. So this is really understanding the trends, being able to identify them, being able to highlight the main points. And then data communication, which is something that's often overlooked in research, I feel, but it is very important, especially in a community college setting, which is if we do find something that's interesting, we have to be able to communicate that out to the rest of the college and our colleagues so that everybody knows what's going on. And this is a part where I feel that the data coaches can really bring a large impact at our college. And I'll get into that a little bit later. So kind of how does data coaching fit into kind of this research feedback loop that I created? It's a hypothetical, but it kind of does make sense. So if somebody comes up with an idea, so that's that light bulb up at the top, and they come to the office of IE to ask for some data. We provide those data, we find those data, and then we do some analyses on those data. We then communicate those results back out to the initial asker, who then thinks about it and usually comes up with a follow-up question, and then this feedback loop kind of keeps going around and around. Where I see data coaching really fitting in is into these 2 specific sections. So conducting the analyses, we're training the data coaches so that they can do some of these data analysis pieces, and then communicating. This is, like I said before, this is a huge part of data coaching. The rationale behind it is, as I touched upon earlier, is that the data coaches already have relationships with their colleagues. So whether that's within your department, discipline, division, so on and so forth. And with those relationships, they've also built up a lot of trust. So we want to leverage what the data coaches already are bringing so that they can have conversations that me as an administrator might not be able to have. With regards to our data coaching program, that's specifically when it's faculty to faculty, talking about their individual course success or retention data. So that's kind of the goal that we're getting at. That takes us to the question of why data coaching. Generally speaking, we always want to hope that data coaching increases our data literacy, especially considering that we are training our data coaches to try to obtain this type of increase the data literacy. But also when the data coaches are able to go around campus and go to different meetings and talk to individuals with that data literacy behind them, they can then make sure that the conversation is going appropriately, that data are being interpreted correctly, and so on and so forth. Also, increased data access and availability. So I feel that data access and data coaching go hand in hand, because in order for our data coaches to be successful, they have to have access to the data. So kind of what happened for us at RCC is we purchased Power BI Enterprise, or a Power BI Premium, which is a business solution, business intelligence solution that allows us to create interactive reports. So now our data coaches are able to filter through data really quickly and have kind of the results almost in real time, versus knowing that you have a meeting coming up, putting in a request to the Office of IE, we provide the data, they get into the meeting, there's a follow-up question, now they got to come back to us to ask for more data, and that process gets a little bit clunky. The top two reasons here, or top 2 points here, we hope lead to the bottom two. So with the increased data literacy and data access, we hope to have more data-informed decisions and then better data communication. And I highlight that bottom one just because it brings us to this kind of like cartoon or saying. We heard this at Santa Monica College, but I know it's not the first time I've heard it, which is data don't drive. And that's specifically in context to a conversation. So we always talk about these data-informed decisions that everybody wants to make, and really that's what we are supposed to be relying on. However, if we just throw up a chart, the data won't actually make that decision for us. There's a series of processes, there's a communication, there's conversations that happen that eventually lead to that decision being made. So the reason why I throw this up there is that it's really important that our data coaches have a good data literacy and understanding of the data, so that they can then lead these conversations to make sure that the correct questions are being asked, that we're diving deeper into the certain areas that we need to go deeper in, so that when we actually do make that decision, it's truly a data-driven conversation. That leads us to our specific purpose. So I know we talked about data coaching, some of the things that it brings to the table, but for us at RCC, it's specifically student equity driven. And this is kind of similar to what Dr. Thompson talked about earlier. On this chart to the right, it's the 2019-20 RCC course success rates. And on the right side is Asian and white students, which was with a course success rate of 72.2%. And then on the left side, it's students of color, which is mainly for our institution, Hispanic and Black students, but also includes Pacific Islander and Native American students as well. And their course success rate is 63.4%. So this represents an 8.8 percentage point gap, which is huge. And as Dr. Thompson mentioned, this isn't unusual. This is something we've seen for many, many years. So with the implementation of data coaching at RCC, it has a very specific student equity lens. And we'll dive into that a little bit deeper later. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Thompson, and he's going to cover why should you join data coaching. But you're muted.
We should join data because it's a driving point behind student success and retention. See, what I end up doing with the data that I find, I have arrived at communication is the #1 priority in keeping students involved. I have been teaching year-round for 22 years. I only take off in August between the school years. Now, this is just me. I'm just being transparent. I'm not asking anybody to do something crazy like that, but I just do it. My time of availability to my students, looking at where they are, looking at the demographics, 70 to 75% of my students are Latinx. 65, 70% of those are young Latinas, female. So what I try to do in reaching out is to make sure that my assignments and things that I am issuing for them to do is understandable. They can comprehend what the language is and what I want through the assignment prompts. So out of that, I have come up with, I need to do a greater degree of accommodation. Sure, I have due dates, but I must be extremely flexible with the due dates. Now, well, don't slap me down now when I say that. Sure, we have due dates, but in this particular environment, there are a lot of things our students are finding themselves involved in. Everything is online, so they have jobs, 1, 2, or 3 jobs. At home, do they have adequate Wi-Fi access? Is it stable? Are they sharing a device with other people, etc., and stuff like that, with siblings, younger, older, parents, grandparents, etc. So accommodation as well as access. Am I available to explain why my blue and green and yellow marks from the Canvas shell, what do they mean? And how do I grade? So don't go out of a percentage, and I tell them this, there's no average, there's no formula. It's strictly the number of points you get within an assignment, which means that if I'm going to be accessible, I have to expand my range of hours. Okay, you're sitting down, right? Okay, I am available Monday through Saturday from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Oh my God, did he say that? Yeah. The students will not take advantage of it. I also give them my cell phone number, 323-574-4203, and tell them, text me. If it's after 8 o'clock, you can still text me. I will get back to you within a short time period. So I use the data to do an individual assessment and also outreach that, hey, I'm here to assist you and to help you as you are on this educational journey, because each one of them are on a separate journey. So I try to utilize that to ensure student success for those who want to. Not every student will buy into that. Also to work within my discipline, which is criminal justice, but also the other department members of sociology, psychology, and anthropology. I share it. And then on top of that, I can learn from others within the department if they are willing to share, but I do most of mine by learning from the students as to what they want from me that will help them as they go on their educational journey. Will you get some pretty interesting feedback? Some very positive, but I hope you have a thick skin, because you're going to have some students who are not going to buy into it and will castigate you because you didn't do this, that, or the other. But that's how I end up interrogating the data that I see. And then I'm also looking at my grade book, the grades on the Canvas shell, to keep up with students, and also seeing when is the last time they checked into the class regarding an assignment coming up and stuff like that. So that's the perspective that I bring in this area. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Thompson. So now we'll move into something that it might be a little bit more boring, but I know it is important when you are trying to set up a program, which is kind of the logistics about it. So we'll go into the program structure. We have a 2-year commitment, and as I mentioned before, this is our first cohort that we're going through, so it's still a new program. But we decided that we needed to have a longer commitment because that first year is a lot of training. You're trying to develop the skills that you'll need to do in order to have these data conversations well. And we want to make sure that once the data coaches have these skills developed, there still is a significant amount of time where they can have these conversations in the important meetings that they'll be in. The second piece is that it's a small initial cohort. We have 8 data coaches for this first cohort. And this was advice from Santa Monica College. And it's mainly because as we're going through this for the very first time, there's a lot of support that I or the Office of IE needs to provide for the data coaches. You know, whether that's they're preparing to have a conversation at a meeting, so they want to prep beforehand, so I meet with them then. Whether that means they're going to attend a meeting, but they'd like some support there, so I attend the meeting with them to make sure that they don't get bombarded with some other data request or terminology or something that they weren't expecting. So there's a lot of support that we have to give to the data coaches, and by having that smaller initial cohort, it ensures that we're able to provide the support that they need to be successful. So that's something that's it's going to be reiterated, but the data coaches are doing a favor for us, and we wanted to make sure that we're doing everything that we can to make sure that they're put in a position where they're going to be successful. So that smaller cohort helps with that. And then the last part is that we wanted to have broad data coaching coverage. We would ideally like to have at least one faculty member from each of our divisions. We were almost able to get that. We were just missing one division. And then we wanted to have classified professional participation as well. And we targeted the co-chairs for our leadership councils. We didn't get all of the classified professional volunteers that we would have ideally liked, but we still got some, and we were more than happy with that. Moving on to the training sessions and the meetings that we have. So the official training sessions that we've had so far, we had one in fall 2020, which is when this program started for us, another in winter 21, and then another one's planned for summer of this year. During these minor terms, because our faculty are obviously not on contract, we have special projects for each of the faculty member data coaches. And then currently we're having monthly check-in meetings, which is kind of serve as like office hours for our data coaches, where they're able to come collaborate with other data coaches, talk with me about what's going on, share best practices, share things that aren't going well. And then also it's a time where they can make sure that they're on the same page. They know what each of the other data coaches is doing or what the plan is. Because all of these data coaches, this isn't their full-time job. They have their actual job too. It just provides an opportunity for everyone to meet and make sure that we're still kind of on track with what we want to be doing. Now moving on to the data coaching expectations. So I've really harped on this before, and I want to continue it again, which is that our data coaches are supposed to be student equity focused. And this serves for 2 reasons. The first one is that the data coaches clearly know what their role is, what they're trying to do, and it helps with some of the buy-in of volunteering to be a data coach is, okay, well, I do care about student equity. I want to close these equity gaps. This is what that program's doing. Okay, I'll volunteer my time to work on that. The second part of it, to add on to that first part, it also allows the opportunity for our data coaches to be successful, because it can be pretty daunting when you think of like data at a college. There's all types of data. There's like millions of different types of data. But we want to make sure that they're just focused on one thing. So when we're talking about the definitions and the metrics and the methodologies that you need to understand, well, they have a narrower range of what they should be focused on and making sure that they understand. The second part is that the college now also understands what the expectations of the data coaches are too. They know, okay, well, we can go to a data coach if we're talking about a student equity related question, but if we're talking about something else, the data coaches aren't the people to be reaching out to. The next expectation is to promote and facilitate data conversations. And then lastly, it's bringing those skills that they learn to the college meetings, whether that's informal, so it's talking to your colleague while you're walking down the hallway, or it's in a more formal setting, so it's a leadership council or a department meeting. With that being said, we wanted to jump into some of those tips and tricks that I mentioned before. There are 3 parts to data coaching, as I mentioned, which are data literacy, analysis, and communication. There's too many areas and to really talk about it right now. We have a limited amount of time. So I'm going to try to drop something into the chat. Hopefully this works. So give me a second here. right. It looks like it works. So there's a PDF in the chat now. So this compiled some of the tips that we have had so far for these different sections. Maybe if we have time left over at the end, we can go into it. But right now, we're just going to go into one example, which is here. It's for the data literacy part. So one of the tips that we have to make sure that our data coaches can be successful is that we do have to define the commonly used metrics and terms. Some of those might be just even what's the definition of equity? So that's kind of a loaded question in itself, but it's something that's important. We need to make sure they're all on the same page there. And then since we are talking about student equity, the disproportionately impacted methodologies, having a good understanding of that's another example of that. The reason why this is so important is because when you get into that meeting, you have a conversation surrounding data, oftentimes there's questions that arise surrounding this. So it's like, well, what does that mean when you're talking about this metric? Or, what about this methodology? And if you prepare the data coaches so that they have a good understanding of what these are, and I see Dr. Thompson laughing because we've covered this before. But if you get into a meeting where it's almost like a gotcha question. I don't think it's always intended like that, but it allows the data coaches to be like, oh yeah, this is what that means, and keep the conversation on track. So that's really important. We'll go through an example of something that we did within our training sessions just so you get an idea of it. And I'll explain why this definition is very important moving forward for our data coaches. But here we have the different types of data. So there are really 3 different types of data. Interesting data, which broadly alerts you to an issue. Useful data, which doesn't really lead you to a tangible answer, but it starts pointing you into the direction that you need to dig further into. And then actionable data, which is kind of like the holy grail for data. This is going to lead you directly to what your next step needs to be in order to correct whatever you are seeing. It's important to note that these types of data kind of stack upon each other. So an interesting piece of data can or should lead you to a useful piece of data, which then should lead you to an actionable piece of data. And to try to solidify kind of these different data types, I have a brief example. So this is all hypothetical data, but technically we could see this in our colleges, and we probably have seen something similar. So here's an interesting piece of data. Just as a reminder, it broadly alerts you to an issue. So here we have course success rates over time. So on the x-axis, we have the years, and on the y-axis is the course success rate. When we click on the next slide, it highlights that in year 4, there was a big decrease in the overall course success. And the reason why it's just broadly alerting you to an issue and not really solving any of the problems or allowing you to solve any of the problems is that there's a million different reasons why there could be a decrease in course success rate. So if you had $10,000 in funding and that's it, and you wanted to correct this problem, well, you could blindly throw it somewhere and hope that it might make the change that you want to see, but the likelihood of that happening is pretty low. So that moves us to a useful piece of data. Basically, you gather a little bit more data. And this, as a reminder, useful data points you into an area needing more inquiry or digging further into, but it doesn't necessarily lead you to a definitive answer. So here we have, over the same time period, it's grade distribution data. So on the x-axis, it's still years, and then on the y-axis, it's the percentage of that letter grade that students were earning. And as you can see, there's a huge increase in W's in year 4, which is the same time when we saw that huge decrease in course success rate. So that's now demonstrating, okay, well, we saw that big decrease in course success rate because of these increase of W's. So it's starting to like hone us in on where the problem is. However, once again, if you only had $10,000 of funding to try to correct this problem, there's still a lot of reasons why students could be withdrawn from courses. So we would ideally like a little bit more data. That leads us to an actionable data, which, as a reminder, reveals specific data that can lead to action. So here it's year 4, we put out a student survey for students that withdrew from a course to try to get more information about what exactly happened. And the thing that stands out here is that there's kind of a low number of withdrawals for the other options, but there's a high number of students that withdrew because there's a lack of access to a computer. So say, for instance, this was in response to like spring 2020 when everything happened with the pandemic. Now with that $10,000, we realize students need access to a computer because of the switch to online. Well, now we can invest in computers or trying to get rental computers pointers for these students so that they don't have to withdraw from the course. So this is kind of the main reason why that, the actionable data is the holy grail, but it's also not always the most prevalent data, which is kind of, I guess you could probably expect. We kind of set up the types of data as like an upside down pyramid. So the interesting data aren't necessarily that helpful, but there's plenty of them. Useful, it's a little bit less, and then actionable, which is the most kind of useful, or not, that's not the right term, but the best data, there's not very much of that. So that's something just to keep in mind. So what we're gonna be doing now is doing some examples. So this is something that we always take our data coaches through, just so that they can kind of test their knowledge or see if things are kind of being solidified in their brains. And before we do that, the one thing that I'll mention is that while we have these 3 different types of data, they don't always fit perfectly in that. So you could have a data that could be useful and interesting, and so on and so forth. So we'll jump into that now. For these examples, just type in the chat what type of data you think it is. So for this first example, it's the percentage of first-time students that persist to the subsequent term. So we'll just give a couple of minutes to let you type in which type of data you think it is. And just so you know, there isn't really a wrong answer. It is up for an interpretation. So we'll do a couple of seconds here, see if anyone else type something in. If not, it's fine. And while we wait for these responses to come in, it'll just be a couple more minutes. I saw a question that said, please share more about how data coaches are identified, non-faculty and or non-instruction, and then the compensation. So while we wait a little bit more for those answers, we identified who we wanted to be data coaches for that first cohort. So a lot of these individuals that are data coaches are heavily involved in student equity as well. We wanted to make sure that we tried to have broad coverage. So for faculty, it was across the different divisions. For non-faculty, we tried to get individuals that were in the leadership councils. And then compensation, because of this first cohort, and we didn't want to have to rely too much on funding, it's just the special projects and the minor terms, which we might have to change in the future. All right, so we see some answers coming in here. And so it says like a combination of like useful, some actionable, a little bit of looks like maybe some interesting. And to be honest, I think it's a good example of why it's so difficult in these moments. I believe that this is a little bit more on the interesting to useful side. It will broadly alert you to potentially an issue if we have a big decrease in the number of students that are persisting to the next term. It's saying, hey, whoa, red flag, something's going on here. However, we'll probably need to dig further on or further into the data in order to determine really what's the root cause. We can try to fix this, and trust me, I've seen it at my college where we see a big broad issue like this and we just throw dollars at it hoping that it's going to go away. But we're really doing that blindly, and in times where we need to be a little bit more efficient with our money, sometimes it's more important to dig a little bit deeper into the actual data. So here's another example. I'm going to skip to this next one because we're running a little bit low on time. So this is 25% of our students experience insecurities. So that's food, housing, technology access, kind of broadly spoken there. So how about this? Does anyone have any ideas on the type of data that this might be? And then I just saw another question. So yeah, we have 8 data coaches currently at RCC in this first cohort. All right, so I like the answers that I'm seeing. I think that they're actually perfect for for the reasons why I brought it up. So for technically speaking, I think that this data is probably in like the useful area, like useful / actionable. But the thing is that sometimes when we have data, we can't wait for it to be the perfect actionable piece of data. Like there are additional pieces of information that we'd like to know. We'd like to know, well, what exactly, like who are these students? Or is it their race, ethnicity, their gender, so on and so forth? That would be nice to be able to know that we're helping the students that need the most help. However, in this instance where it's insecurity, it's like students are hungry or students don't have a place to sleep. Sometimes we still have to implement something, even if we might not have all of the answers. So this is just a piece of, it's a good example of that, where sometimes we just have to act because we can't let our students suffer too much. But I do think that kind of covers potentially all three of those types of data, as someone mentioned in the chat. All right. So now we're going to move briefly on to some of the successes that we've seen so far from our data coaches. As I mentioned before, this program hasn't even been a year old yet. We've planned for a little bit longer than that, but we've only implemented it in the previous fall. The first big success is that one of our data coaches led an English equity workshop where we had over 50 faculty participants in this workshop. It was largely English faculty, which makes sense. However, there was a decent number of faculty members from different disciplines. So that was fantastic to see. Within this workshop, the data coach that led it had all of the participants email me beforehand so that I could provide them their individual faculty data or individual course success data. And then we kind of went over that. So I provided a write-up for each of those participants. We talked about the importance of it, and then there's kind of a commitment at the end that each one of these participants would reach out to me for follow-up data, so more updated course success data within at least once a year, and preferably once after every major term. So that was a fantastic win. On top of that, this data coach is also planning to have a workshop series in the fall where she will be taking a small cohort of faculty through a gradebook exercise throughout the term. So I think that that's a great idea. I think it's going to be fantastic, and I think she's going to do a great job there. And then the second is a triage report, which was an idea that was brought up by one of our data coaches. And the rationale that he had for that is that he wanted a one-page infographic that was easy to digest, and it would have the same metrics. So it's a completion of transfer level math and English in the first year, and then course success rate, all disaggregated by race, ethnicity. And this would be released after every major term. And the reasoning behind this is that it would highlight the student groups or the racial ethnic groups that were not succeeding at the same rate as the other groups, so that when we were doing our equity work and pumping resources to try to increase the success of certain racial or equity or disproportionately impacted groups, that there would be clear reasoning and rationale for why that was happening. So that was something that we have been working on. We put it together, and it's kind of going through the rounds now, going through our shared governance. And then just to try to end it off here, there's the summit questions that we were asked to kind of respond to. So I'll go through that pretty quickly. The first is, how has this improved the student experience? And quite frankly, our program is a little new to know if we have improved the student experience. However, the goal of this program is to definitely do that. So we are hoping that student success is going to increase, especially for our disproportionately impacted and historically minoritized groups. We hope to see that within the classroom. So with faculty, being able to talk with faculty and try to share out best practices or help change kind of the material that's being taught so that it's a little bit more student-centric. We hope to see increased success rates there. We hope to see improvements in our student services as well from this. But once again, we're gonna have to loop back on this in a year or two to see if we're seeing the effect that we wanted to see. The second question is, how has this addressed or improved racial equity on our campus? So once again, because the program is new, we can't really confirm that it has improved racial equity at our campus, but the purpose of the program is to definitely target racial equity and close those equity gaps. Our data coaches have a very narrow focus on equity, so that's what we hope to see movement there. The third question is, what role did data play in your effort? As hopefully you can see from the presentation, data plays an integral part of our program. Our data coaches are brought up to speed on the student equity data. They're expected to have a good understanding of those data and then to be able to communicate those data with our peers and our colleagues. The fourth question is, what role did student voice, engagement, ownership play in your effort, and why did it matter? So this one's actually a little bit tougher for us because we don't have students like directly involved in our data coaching program, nor do we really plan on having students directly in it. However, we try to incorporate the student voice through surveys. So we have, as I imagine that most of you have, we had a lot of surveys go out during the pandemic. And we were able to gather the student voice on what were some of the challenges that the students faced during this transition to the online modality. And what we did is we compiled those and we shared them with our RCC faculty to try to get a series of like best practices of what did the faculty do in order to combat some of those challenges that the students were facing, or brainstorm some ideas of what you could do in the future to help out students that were in a similar situation. And we then provided those to our data coaches. So it's kind of like building a list of best practices that we can share to the rest of our RCC campus, but it's all based off of the student voice. So that's how we hope to continue incorporating the student voice through the data coaching program. And then for that fifth question, I don't think we really need to answer it because we answered the first four. And with that, are there any questions that you have? Left a pretty good amount of time in case anybody does have questions, because I know it was a brief presentation, but we'll open it up to that now.
Hey, Brandon.
Yes.
Before we get out, let me emphasize to the group, try not to take this data analysis and all of that and impose it as an added responsibility to existing staff members, faculty, or whatever. We are where we are because of Wendy McEwen, who is the dean. She wasn't initially the dean, but she rose to that position from the position that Brandon is now. And because of the two of them working together, we are where we are. So try not to put this and say, well, okay, this is an added responsibility to someone else. No, make this such an important priority issue that you end up bringing in people who can advance the effort without added encumbrances from something else that they have to do.
Thanks. Thank you, Oliver. That's a really great point. So I see a question of, but how are we able to recruit people without compensating them? That's also a great question. We were able to do it because the people that we targeted, and we can do this in our first cohort, I think we'll be able to do it in our second cohort as well. These are people that are heavily invested in student equity at RCC. I know that every one of you at your campuses, you have people that are like that as well. So it's the people that are already, hook, line, and sinker, they're bought in and they're ready to do the work, and they're trying to find like an avenue to get it outside of just their own silo. So that's where we are right now. Talking with the other colleges that we've worked with, I know that it's not that I know, I expect that might change in the future. We might have to compensate people, but as of right now, that's not the plan. The plan right now is that we have people that are heavily invested in the work. One thing that I also like to just throw on top of what Dr. Thompson mentioned is that sometimes it's taken as like data coaching is just an extension of the Office of IE, and it's just done to have more researching power. And that's not the intention that we have. To be quite honest, that having a data coaching program for me is more work than me trying to just talk with faculty themselves that want to talk with me and doing that analysis, because there's a lot of support that goes on. However, it's really leveraging those relationships that faculty already have. So just keep that in mind too when you're advertising this or when you're proposing it. It's not going to make less work for the Office of IE. It'll end up making more work or just the same amount of work, but just keep that in mind. Does anyone else have any other questions? All right, so we do have a few minutes. It looks like there aren't any questions. What I will do though is share that, we can go over the sheet that I put in the chat real quick, just so that you know what's in there. So I'm gonna share that real quick. So it's a little, the data literacy part, we kind of covered that already. And it's just like one tip that I have for each section. The data analysis, I talk about the tool that we use, so that Power BI tool. So if you scroll down to page 3, this is a screenshot of the tool that we use. So this is kind of what the data coaches see. Within this, you're able to see a bunch of different filters so the data coaches can go through that real quick to, if they are looking at a specific discipline or a specific course, they're able to do that on the fly. And then the big part that I would say that we want to highlight with whatever data tool you provide the data coaches is that it's easier to see what the main highlights or takeaways are. So the way that this dashboard's set up is the disproportionately impacted groups are going to show up as red. So they're really highlighted, easy to see. And then I created this closed gap calculation, which is basically the number of additional students needed to close that equity gap. So it shows like the magnitude of what the equity gap is. So it's just like little tips like that that can make it easier for the analysis part for the data coaches. And then, okay, I need to repost the file that I sent. So let me do that real quick.
Well, while you're doing that, can I just add, I don't know if I guess that's a question, but
yeah.
And I'm sure it happens quite a bit with your campus. We recently were able to access our individual data anonymously, of course, and there was a lot of anxiety about that, and folks really just began to question the data itself. And so I'm wondering how you navigate that when people kind of basically don't trust what they see, or there are all these other. There's a lot of context, right?
Right.
Their kind of discussion about it. So I'm just wondering.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great question. It's something that we kind of go over with our data coaches, and I know all of our data coaches have seen their data, so I've done it with them as well. It's like I forget where I actually heard it, but like the compliment sandwich type thing. It's like just like a normal communication like technique, but I definitely use it when I'm having these types of conversations. There's always something great that as faculty is doing that you can see in the data, and there's always something bad. So what I try to do is I always, start with that really good thing and try to like highlight what's going on here. This student group's doing great. So how can we then apply that to this other student group that's not doing great? So that's kind of my way around it, is to kind of reaffirm the good things that the faculty are doing. Because I mean, to be honest, every faculty member, I feel, is putting in work to try to make sure that students succeed. Like I can go with that assumption that you're faculty because you want students to succeed. So I don't want to discredit all the work you've been doing. So it's kind of just navigating that conversation.
Yeah, but also, I guess it's Roy, it depends upon how you approach it. I would change the terminology. Great things that you're doing, and are there things as they look over the data that they might improve upon? Just kind of throw out the hint, see if you can get the fishing hook out there that might hook them in. And then also for those faculty who have bought in, have them at their department meetings regularly share what has come out of their view of the data, their analysis of their data and things like that. Because if they respect the person, then they are saying, okay, maybe that's something I might want to look at. Might. Not that they will necessarily, but might want to look at.
I did see a question coming in about not including students in this process. And the main reason for this is we don't plan on having student data coaches. This is something that it will need to be, for the most part, it's going to be peer-to-peer conversations. So that's the rationale for not including students as data coaches. I could see, yeah, that's kind of where we are with that. There might be maybe we need to have more discussion about how we can incorporate students more, not directly into the program, but indirectly. So that's a good point that was brought up there. And then I'll just jump into the last little bit that we have. So getting into the data communication. Oh, here's a data analysis part, but we have like a structured fillable PDF that kind of guides the data coaches to get through the analysis part. So some of them are pretty basic questions just to get familiar with the data layout. And then it gets into a little bit more, so like trends and whatnot. But this is where I wanted to get to, because I think it's really important. So when we get to that data communication part, a lot of what the data coaches will have to do are navigating these potentially challenging conversations. And the best way to prepare for that is to just practice it. So we go through some case studies where we tackle this problem or this issue, this situation that comes up that hypothetically is one of the worst situations that you could be put into. But if you prepare for that worst situation, then you kind of are ready for it if it does come up, or anything that's less than that. So I put in 2 case studies that we tackled as a group just in here, so that potentially you might do something similar to that as well. I just thought that was a really helpful tip for our data coaches when we were going through this. I hear what you're saying, Angela, about students know it and need what you need and what you want. And that is very, very true. Something that I know, not necessarily in the data coaching aspect, but I know that we've provided at RCC tons of surveys, and we need to make sure that we are taking the results that the students are providing us and then making changes or changing where resources are flowing based off of that, because that is true. Students do know what they need and students know what they want. All right, well, we're wrapping up. Is there any last comments that anyone wants to have? Oh, I see one other. That's actually a really good point, Eartha, talking about how this, it's a potentially a research opportunity for students, or how could we incorporate students into some of maybe our IE work, so that they can get a better idea of kind of that research side of things. That's a good idea. So Karen, I'm trying to post the tools again, and I'm not sure why it's not working. I'm gonna type my email in the chat. If you just email me, I will make sure to send that off your way.
And
All right.
my email is there as well. So if you want to reach out to me as faculty about stuff, feel free.
All right. Thank you, everyone for attending. I appreciate it, or we appreciate it.